One of the world's most famous airline captains announced he's living with Alzheimer's disease. Captain Sully Sullenberger recently revealed his diagnosis.
He once brought a broken airplane down onto a river without losing a single life, and the world called it a miracle. 16 years later, that same man just told the public he is facing a fight he cannot land his way out of. This week, Chesley Sullenberger, the pilot who became a symbol of calm under pressure, revealed that he has been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. He is 75 years old, and instead of keeping the news private, he chose to share it with the world in his own words, on his own website, in the same steady voice that once talked a cabin full of terrified passengers through the unthinkable. This is the story of how a boy from a small Texas town became one of the most trusted men in American aviation, and why, even now, facing something he cannot outfly, he is choosing honesty over silence. Long before he was known as Sully, he was simply Chesley Burnett Sullenberger III, a boy growing up in Denison, Texas, a quiet city not far from the Oklahoma border. His family had German-Swiss roots that traced back generations, and he grew up with one younger sister in a household built on discipline rather than noise. Even as a child, there were signs that he was wired differently than most kids his age. He built model planes, he watched military jets thunder overhead from a nearby Air Force base, and something about the sky seemed to pull at him in a way that never really let go. He was also simply brilliant. His grades placed him near the very top of nearly every subject, and by the time he was 11 years old, his test scores were already strong enough to qualify him for Mensa. In high school, he led the Latin club, played flute in the school band, and graduated close to the top of his class, all while quietly working toward something else entirely, a life in the air. By 14, he already had a glider pilot's license, an unusual achievement for a young teenager. 2 years later, at 16, he was flying a small propeller plane from a modest airstrip near his home. That early passion carried him directly into the United States Air Force Academy, where he entered as part of the class of 1973. He didn't just attend the Academy's glider program, he excelled at it, becoming an instructor for other cadets before he had even finished his first year. When he graduated, he walked away with the title of top flyer in his class, an early hint of the exceptional precision that would define the rest of his career. From there, the Air Force sent him to Purdue University, where he earned a master's degree focused on industrial and organizational psychology, a subject that might seem unrelated to flying jets, but one that would quietly shape how he thought about human behavior, decision-making, and communication under stress for the rest of his life. His military career took him through advanced jet training and eventually into the cockpit of the F-4 Phantom, a fighter aircraft he flew while stationed with squadrons in England and in Nevada. He rose to the rank of captain, and during this period, he also served on boards that investigated aircraft accidents, an experience that gave him a front-row seat to exactly how small failures can spiral into catastrophic outcomes. By 1980, he had left active duty behind and moved into commercial aviation, eventually landing with US Airways and the carriers that came before it. Over the following 3 decades, he would rack up tens of thousands of flight hours. But flying passengers was never the only thing he was doing. He worked as a flight instructor, served as an accident investigator with federal aviation authorities, and took on safety leadership roles within his pilots' union, helping build training programs that are still used across the industry today. He even helped shape a national approach to teaching flight crews how to work together and communicate clearly during emergencies, a program he personally taught to hundreds of fellow pilots and crew members over the years. None of that quiet, behind-the-scenes expertise meant anything to the general public until one freezing afternoon in January of 2009. Sullenberger was in command of US Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus climbing out of LaGuardia Airport in New York, headed for Charlotte, North Carolina. Less than 2 minutes after takeoff, the plane flew directly into a flock of Canada geese, and almost instantly, both engines lost power. There he was, at the controls of a powerless commercial jet, gliding silently above one of the most crowded cities on the planet, with 155 people counting on him to figure out what to do next. Air traffic control offered him a chance to circle back to LaGuardia or divert to a nearby airport in New Jersey. In the span of a few seconds, Sullenberger determined that neither option would work in time, and made the call that would define the rest of his life. He was going to put the plane down on the Hudson River. What happened next has been studied by aviation experts around the world ever since. Sullenberger later admitted that hearing both engines go silent produced a feeling of dread unlike anything else in his flying career, and that the moments right before the plane touched the water were the most frightening of his life. And yet the landing itself was remarkably smooth. The aircraft stayed intact on the surface of the river, giving everyone on board time to climb out onto the wings and into the small boats that reached them within minutes. Sullenberger didn't rush off the sinking plane himself. He walked the aisle twice, making absolutely sure no one had been left behind, before he became the very last person to step off the aircraft. Investigators who studied the incident afterward agreed that putting the plane down on the river had been the right call, since standard emergency procedures simply weren't designed for an engine failure happening seconds after takeoff, so low to the ground, so close to a densely populated city. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He received a personal call from the sitting president, and the incoming president invited the entire flight crew to attend his inauguration just days later. Both chambers of Congress passed resolutions honoring him and his crew. New York City handed him a key to the city. A magazine ranked him among the most influential people in the world that year. He and his crew were even brought out for a standing ovation at the Super Bowl, just weeks after the crash, a strange and sudden spotlight for a man who, by every account from people who knew him, was naturally shy and preferred to stay out of the public eye. None of it would have mattered without the ferry captains and tugboat crews who reached the sinking plane within minutes and pulled frightened passengers out of the freezing water before the cold could become dangerous. That teamwork, more than any single person's actions, is the reason everyone on that flight walked away and lived to tell their story. Today, the actual aircraft sits on permanent display at a museum in Charlotte that now carries his name, a physical reminder of the afternoon that changed everything. Rather than quietly fading from the spotlight once the headlines slowed down, Sullenberger spent the next decade building an entirely new chapter of his life around teaching and advocacy. He kept flying commercially until 2010, closing out 3 decades with the airline on a final flight from Florida to Charlotte, joined by his co-pilot and some of the very passengers who had survived the Hudson landing with him. That same year, France recognized him with one of its highest honors, and he served as Grand Marshal of the Tournament of Roses Parade. In 2009, he partnered with a journalist to write a memoir that went far beyond the river landing, opening up about deeply personal territory, including his father's death by suicide years earlier and the grief that followed him quietly for years. That kind of honesty was rare for a public figure of his stature, and it turned him into an outspoken voice for suicide prevention awareness long before that topic became easier to talk about publicly. That same memoir eventually became the basis for a major Hollywood film released in 2016, bringing his story to an entirely new audience who had only ever known him as a headline from years earlier. He also became one of the most recognizable voices in television aviation coverage, joining a major news network as an on-air analyst, someone millions of viewers turned to whenever a plane crash or aviation emergency made headlines somewhere in the world. He was invited to speak in front of business and government leaders at international forums, sharing what he had learned about decision-making under extreme pressure. He picked up major honors from aviation organizations recognizing his decades of contributions to flight safety, and later awards recognizing him as a skilled public communicator, someone who could explain complicated, technical situations in a way ordinary people could actually understand and trust. He didn't stop pushing the industry to do better, either. After a pair of tragic crashes involving a widely used passenger jet a few years later, Sullenberger became one of the loudest and most credible critics of the manufacturer and the regulators who were supposed to be overseeing them. He testified in front of Congress, arguing that those crashes should never have happened, and that a system meant to catch dangerous design flaws had instead let far too many warning signs slip through. He continued raising concerns even years afterward, whenever new aviation leadership seemed to waver on maintaining strict pilot training standards. In 2021, he was nominated to serve as the United States Ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Organization, a position confirmed by the Senate that placed him at the center of global conversations about how to keep flying safe for everyone. He presented his credentials in Montreal in early 2022 and served through that summer. One more chapter in a career that had somehow carried him from a small airstrip in Texas all the way to representing his country on the world stage. Away from all of that attention, his personal life stayed remarkably grounded. He married Laurie Henry, a fitness instructor, back in 1989, and the two of them settled down in Danville, California, where they adopted 2 daughters and built an ordinary family life that looked nothing like the public image people had of him. Friends who have known him for decades describe someone who was capable of extraordinary composure during a crisis, but who spent most of his evenings focused on homework, dinner, and the small, unremarkable routines of raising 2 kids, the same routines millions of other parents know well. Which brings us to this latest chapter, the one that has nothing to do with engines or rivers or emergency landings, and everything to do with something quieter and, in some ways, far more difficult to face. In the middle of July, Sullenberger posted a personal statement on his own website, sharing that he had recently been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. He described noticing subtle changes over time, moments where a name wouldn't come to him as easily as it used to, times he caught himself repeating a story he had already told, along with disrupted sleep that had become part of his new normal. He explained that he is working closely with a specialist at UCSF Medical Center in San Francisco, a doctor he credited with helping him understand just how many families around the world are quietly living with this same disease. In his own words, he described Alzheimer's as an unwelcome visitor that had shown up uninvited at his door, a description that felt honest rather than dramatic, much like the way he once explained a water landing in plain, unembellished terms rather than dressing it up for effect. What stands out most about the announcement is not just what he shared, but why he chose to share it at all. He didn't have to make this public. He could have kept it private, quietly managed his care, and let very few people outside his immediate family know what he was going through. Instead, he made a deliberate choice to speak openly, explaining that he hoped doing so might spare other families some of the isolation that so often comes with a diagnosis like this. He has talked before about the idea that courage can be contagious, something he used to say about the outcome of that flight back in 2009, and it seems that same philosophy is now guiding how he is choosing to handle this next chapter of his life. Rather than disappearing from public view, he described himself as being at the very beginning of a long journey, and he seems determined to walk through it the same way he has approached nearly everything else in his life, openly, honestly, and without pretending things are easier than they are. His wife Laurie also spoke about the diagnosis, describing him as the same steady presence he has always been, both before the Hudson landing and now, once again, after this new and very different kind of challenge. She talked about the family's intention to keep living fully and finding joy in ordinary, everyday moments, even with an uncertain road ahead. That kind of honesty from both of them mirrors something Sullenberger has done before. He was similarly candid, years after the Hudson landing, about quietly struggling with symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress in the weeks that followed, describing sleeplessness and recurring flashbacks despite the calm, composed image the public had of him. He was just as open about the pain of losing his father to suicide, a disclosure that helped normalize a conversation many public figures still avoid entirely, even today. This latest announcement fits that same lifelong pattern, choosing to be transparent about hard things instead of hiding behind the image people expect from him. It's worth remembering that Alzheimer's disease affects millions of families, and that there is currently no cure, though earlier detection tools and newer treatment options have given many recently diagnosed patients more choices than were available even a decade ago. Symptoms typically progress gradually over time, even when they start out mild, which is part of why doctors increasingly emphasize catching the disease as early as possible. When a public figure with as much trust and credibility as Sullenberger chooses to speak openly about a diagnosis like this, it often does something that awareness campaigns alone struggle to do. It gives people permission to talk about it too, whether that's a family member, a coworker, or someone quietly going through the exact same thing without anyone around them knowing.